Welcome to Cultivating Wisdom with John Vervaeke. We are live streaming every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. The Discord server, and the links for the Discord server will be in the description of this video, is continuing to have the daily meditation sits. We want to put together a compilation video to mark the end of the daily sits. It would be helpful if everyone could please send in a clip of no more than 10 seconds about your experience as part of the Sangha community to amar@johnvervaeke.com. amar@johnvervaeke.com. For those of you who are joining for the meditation practice, please take a look at the description of this video and you'll find links to previous meditation and contemplation lessons and sits. Please do the first lesson and continue to do a lesson or maybe 2 lessons every week. Continue to meet with us Saturday morning, and you'll very quickly integrate into the entire ecology of practices and into the Sangha and the Discord community. I would ask everybody to please like this stream to increase the visibility on the YouTube algorithm. We go for an hour now. We go from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern Time. At the end, there'll be a time for questions. Please limit questions to this ecology of practices. But if you have more general questions, please join me the third Friday of every month at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, live streamed on YouTube. So we will begin a Saturday Dharma Day, or we're thinking of calling it Saturday Sangha Day, a little bit more alliteration, eh? We're going to begin always with sitting. We'll begin as normally with chanting. If you're unfamiliar with the chanting, don't worry about it. You'll find it in the lessons as you work your way through. Just do as best you can. We'll begin with chanting, then we'll go into a silent sit. We'll cut to the second camera. I'll go to the whiteboard, and we'll begin the Dharma, and we'll begin the second stage. We'll move into the high school in the Wisdom of Hypatia course, and we'll start talking about Stoicism. But first, let's get ourselves oriented, get ourselves into our basic posture. Set your phones on Do Not Disturb. We will begin together when I say begin. Begin. One. One. Begin your silent sit. slowly come out of your practice, trying as best you can to integrate what you cultivated in your practice with your everyday consciousness, cognition, character, and communitas, perhaps by reciting the 5 promises. Okay, I'm going to move to the whiteboard and we will begin the Dharma. So, we're going to begin with a background today for an understanding of Stoicism. You should be reading through the 2nd degree in the McClellan book, The Wisdom of Hypatia. But let's begin. And as always, we begin with the exemplary figure of Socrates. And we went through the channel through Epictetus. This time we're going through another one of his disciples. We, of course, will end with his greatest disciple, who is Plato. But here's another very important one. And this is Antisthenes. He was a follower of Socrates, and he wrote stuff, but he didn't put as much emphasis on theory and argumentation as Plato did. And so people asked him, well, what did you learn from Socrates? And he said something that is either extremely trivial or extremely profound, depending on your reaction to it. And what did he say? What he said is, I learned how to converse with myself. And of course, this is dialogos, dialogue. Right? Now, one of the things we may say is, big deal, I talk to myself all day long. And I take it, and most people who followed Antisthenes took it that he didn't mean that. He meant something that is a radical transformation of how we talk to ourselves all day long. But let's ask a question that isn't really asked here, at least directly, but is asked directly very much in modern cognitive science. It's something, and even in modern psychotherapy. Why do we talk to each other? Not to each other. Why do we talk to ourselves all day long? And you could see that I was leaping ahead a little bit in my thinking. It has to do with the fact that we, of course, learn to talk by talking to other people. And in fact, here's an interesting thing that is becoming more and more the case, in the sense that we're realizing it more and more to be true. The brain's relationship to itself, your brain's relationship to itself, is enmeshed, overlaps with, is often not distinguished from your brain's relationship to other brains. So one way of thinking about this is cognition, your thinking, and your making sense of things is not primarily monological. It's not a monologue. It is primarily dialogical. That in order to think, we think best when we think dialogically. And there's more and more evidence that we are actually better when we're doing that in actual dialogue. And we'll talk about this when we talk about the Neoplatonic practice of dialectic, which is using this relationship of how we talk to each other and how we talk to ourselves in order to gauge in significant transformation. So let's remember this. Cognition is inherently dialogical, even though our culture pretends, and it is a very significant form of bullshitting pretense, that we are monological beings. That's how our thinking primarily operates and works. We carry around other people in our heads all day long. And some of you might have encountered that aspect a little bit more saliently in some of the practices we do with meditative inquiry and metta and things like that. The 5 factors of inquiring mindfulness, etc. Okay, so this idea that we're inherently dialogical, and of course Socrates models that. So Plato writes dialogues in which Socrates is in discussion, and we'll come back to this point. Socrates makes a continual argument, he makes it repeatedly, that his dialoguing with other people and his process of self-examination are one, they're not one and the same, but they're completely at one with each other. They're mutually interpenetrating, mutually affording of each other. All right, so let's pick this up. So the idea here is we're doing this all day long. Our thinking is inherently dialogical. Now, what that means, I want to say something here that's, and it's intended to be a little bit provocative. Untutored, right? Untutored inner dialogue is better than no dialogue at all. Okay. That means we do it because it's adaptive. It really helps our cognition. When you meet unfortunate individuals that haven't had that proper engagement with dialogue and socially distributed cognition, they are seriously truncated as cognitive agents. It's questionable, not in a moral sense, but in a metaphysical sense, whether they are persons. So this is why we do it. We do it because we have internalized, we'll come back to that, remember when we talked about internalizing the sage, we have internalized the capacity to generate thought through speech, by speaking with others and then listening to others, and then we can do that with ourselves. So this is better than no dialogue at all. But, and this is a very important but, and this is a Stoic principle. Evil doesn't come from when we choose what is bad. Evil comes when we choose a lesser good in place of a greater good. Untutored dialogue is better than no dialogue at all. It's adaptive, but that doesn't mean it's optimal or the best for us. Because most of this inner dialogue is narrative in nature, and we practice narrative, and this is Daniel Hudo's idea. We're constantly practicing narrative. We're constantly teaching our kids narrative, and we simplify narrative because it's actually not natural to us. We have to practice it. We use dialogue to get good at narrative, and then we internalize it, and we start to see ourselves and identify with ourselves as a story. We're a story, and there's a story going on here, right? And this is narrative. Also very adaptive. Narrative allows you to identify with your future self and your past self. It creates a temporally extended self, which is great for planning. It's great for long-term moral responsibility. You can hold me responsible for something that I did 10 years ago because there is a narrative identity between me now and that person then. Again, narrative is adaptive. It's needed, right? But the problem with narrative, right, is it creates a narrative bias. See, people are hungry for narrative. And like anything that's adaptive and we hunger for, it can be hijacked in an addictive fashion. So what do I mean by people are hungry for narrative? Well, there's some horrible event on the news. And what do people need? They need to know, what's the story? What's the story? What's the story? And then once they get the story, there's like, oh, okay. It's like the consequences of what that horrible event haven't disappeared. But now there's a story. And what we see is that what narrative tends to do is it tends to create a whole bunch of biases along with it. narrative drives, the narrative bias, I hope that this blue is still visible. Is this still okay, the blue? That's still good? Okay. It drives confirmation bias. So the confirmation bias is, and we're going to need this when we talk about active open-mindedness, confirmation bias is our tendency to only look for evidence that confirms what we believe. Right? So when people get a story, they will tend to only notice and find relevant and salient things that fit their story, and they will tend to ignore any of the evidence that could potentially challenge it. So an obvious case where the narrative bias is driving the confirmation bias is conspiracy theory thinking, where people think they have some story that makes sense of everything, and then they engage in the confirmation bias. The other thing that this drives is it drives overestimation biases. And these interact with each other, by the way, these two biases. The overestimation bias is people think when they have a story, they have all of the information about a particular situation. And they also overestimate how good they are at making sense of things. So all of these biases kick in. Again, this is, right, they are precisely powerful biases because they are hijacking something that is adaptive in nature. But maybe we can do better. The other problem with another way in which the inner dialogue often goes off the rails is rumination. You know what this is like when you get in an anxiety spiral, and you get all these biases also spinning on each other. And you keep thinking in a way that's driving your anxiety, and you can't let it go, or your depression, and you start to spin in rumination. This is a very powerful driver of anxiety and depression. And it's a very complicated process, but it is very much driven by the fact that your cognition is inherently dialogical in nature. So untutored, it's adaptive. One more time, it's adaptive. That's why we do it. But it's so compelling and addictive also because it's so adaptive. And like anything that is adaptive, it can become maladaptive. So the Stoics, right, the cynics and the followers of Socrates were looking at this, and especially Antisthenes and his followers, and they were saying, all right, the problem, so what Antisthenes is basically saying, when I learned how to converse with myself, is untutored inner dialogue generates bad judgment. Untutored inner dialogue, well, that's not coming from Socrates. Untutored inner dialogue is driving bad judgment. Bad judgment. And it's hard to deal with, again, precisely because cognition is inherently dialogical, and that is adaptive, and because we have enculturated narrative into us, because that's so adaptive. Right? The ways in which that goes wrong are so addictive and compelling and hard to deal with. We get bad judgment. Now, we need to understand the way the Stoics are using this term, judgment. In order to do that, we have to look at the group of people that first came out of Antisthenes. So the line goes from Socrates to Antisthenes, and then he, right? So Antisthenes is the person I've been talking about with the learning to converse with yourself, and then he has students that, and one of the most famous of his students is Diogenes, and Diogenes is a cynic. Now, we use this word incorrectly in a degenerative fashion. We think somebody who's cynical because they don't believe in anything, there's a secret agenda. That's not what the ancient meaning of cynicism was at all. It shows you how our culture really deeply misunderstands its own wisdom tradition by the way in which it has malformed and misunderstood many of these central terms and ideas. Okay, so Diogenes, he's famous. You probably know of him. He was on one of the covers of the Led Zeppelin album. He's a figure in the tarot. You know, the hermit carrying the lamp, right? Carrying the lamp, looking for the one honest person. We'll come back to that in a minute. But what the cynics, like Diogenes, following Antisthenes, thought the bad judgment. What do they mean by bad judgment? Well, when we hear judgment, we hear belief, what you believe. But again, we have lost a lot of this. This comes from a German word, right? Beleben, which translates as beloved. It's what you set your heart on. That's what judgment is. It's not primarily generating belief, how do we now understand it, sentences or propositions that we assert. This is the act of setting your heart on something. Setting your heart on something. And the idea here is that this is very much like Dweck's work, which we'll talk about later, on mindsets, the way we set our mind and set our heart, which is not the same thing as just having a set of beliefs. So think about what we mean when we say you set your heart on something, and it's beloved by us. So we're finding it particularly relevant and salient and important. We're binding our identity to it. When someone is your beloved, you don't just have beliefs about them. Oh yes, I believe they're a good person. I believe. Of course you have beliefs about them. I'm not denying that. But you don't just have beliefs about them. There is a commitment of what you find relevant, salient, important, identification, and you begin to internalize that person and allow them to shape your identity in a profound way. Okay, that's what we're talking about with judgment here. We're not talking about simply the act of coming to certain beliefs. We're talking about something much deeper and more profound. And the cynics argued that what our bad judgment is we set our heart on the wrong thing. That's what cynicism originally meant. So what the cynics thought is that most people set their hearts on things that are created by social convention rather than on natural or moral law. And then the idea here is, because social conventions change and shift around and are not ultimately grounded in anything deeply rational, we will ultimately be disappointed when we set our heart on things that are created by social convention. So, Diogenes, what's he doing with that lamp? Well, he's in the marketplace, right? And he's doing this provocative thing. It's very interesting about the kind of thing that Diogenes is doing. He's not really offering argument like Socrates is. And that shows us another side of Socrates that we tend to forget. He's instead trying to do this provocative. He's almost doing performance art, and he's trying to provoke people. He's carrying this lamp around looking for what? And people are, what are you looking for, Diogenes? And he won't tell them, well, what are you looking for? And they're in the marketplace, and they're doing all this stuff. What are you looking for? What are you looking for? Come on. And then he says, I'm looking for one honest person. So people are in the marketplace, and they're seeking and looking, and they're looking for all this stuff, right? But most of it is, think about this entity that we all set our hearts on. Money only exists by social convention. If you take out a coin, look at it, remember this. If we all agree or remember that it doesn't have any actual inherent value, and that's what sometimes happens, right? People panic and realize, oh, this stuff doesn't really exist, and then it all collapses and falls apart, right? So people are in the marketplace doing all this, but what they're not concerned with is something that has intrinsic value. Honesty. Honesty. And this comes from something, in fact, Socrates is famous for doing. He walked into the marketplace and he said, oh, wow, look at all the things I don't need. So, what the Cynics engaged in is two things together, social renunciation and social provocation. And what they're trying to do with that, so the renunciation and the provocation are trying to bring about two things, right? Are working together to bring about something. So you have the social renunciation, renunciation, I believe that's correct, and then social provocation, like what I just described with Diogenes. That sort of performance art. Both of these are working together to create, right, an existential reframing. People fundamentally reframing their sense of the agent-arena relationship, their identity, their existential mode. We talked a lot about that when we talked about meta and reciprocal opening. So Diogenes, for example, left Athens and lived outside of the city in a barrel, famously. This is where this comes from. Cynic means living like a dog, right? That's what it actually means. So the cynics did not want to set their hearts on all these things that are created by social convention, kind of like sort of hippies, right? And so they lived outside the city, and then they also did provocative things because they were trying to get people to really existentially reframe and alter what they find relevant, salient, and important, what they identify with. Fundamentally alter at an existential level what they set their hearts on. Famously, when Diogenes was in his barrel, Alexander the Great, here's the emperor of the world, comes up to Diogenes, and he comes up and he's got, I always picture there's all these, there's maybe even elephants, I don't know why. There's this big thing and they come up and there's Diogenes, and Alexander says, I am Alexander. And Alexander was very much about creating this whole mythos of him being a god man. And he says to Diogenes, I can give you anything you want. Anything. What do you want? And Diogenes said, can you move a little to the left? You're blocking my sunlight. Right? Social renunciation, social provocation, trying to really reframe people. Now, what's interesting about this, right, is the Stoics noted that there's a bit of a contradiction. Well, this is very powerful stuff. It's famous pictures of Diogenes in the barrel, and like I said, carrying the lamp, have become, regular icons in our culture. People often don't even know why. The fact that it was on the Led Zeppelin album and in the Tarot, I think, is something very, very important. Okay, so what did the Stoics, so there was a guy named Zeno, and he was influenced by the Cynics, but he also loved Plato. And he thought we needed to put together the two sides, the aspect of Socrates that had come from Antisthenes and the aspect of Socrates that had come from Plato. And he picked up on a problem within cynicism. And this is the idea that the Cynics paid too much attention to the objects of bad judgment and not enough attention to the process of judgment. Too much emphasis, and we do this. This is one of our besetting cognitive biases. We pay too much attention to the objects of our thought and the products of our thought, and very little attention to the processes of our thinking, of our judgment. So, the Stoics said, we will talk about this, but we want to put much more emphasis on this. The process. Because it's not what you're setting your heart on, because they realize that this bad judgment can be about anything, or practically anything. It's more the process of how you set your heart upon things. All right, so what's the process that they're interested in? Well, it's a process you're familiar with. It's a process that we have talked about before. It is the process of, and I used, if you remember at the time when we were doing the meditation course, I referenced the Stoics. It's the process of co-identification. That identification, I'm always doing this in a interdependent conjoined fashion. I am assuming an identity as an agent, and I'm assigning identities to things as an arena. So right now I'm the teacher, you're the student, etc. This is a classroom. I'm assuming and assigning identities, and I'm doing that. I'm doing it largely unconsciously, automatically, and reactively. And remember, I gave you this little acronym. I'm doing it mindlessly, I'm doing it automatically, and I'm doing reactively. And that is what is marring my judgment. That is what is marring my judgment. And so this is all about the existential modes. So the Stoics, and we talked about this when we were talking about meta, actually noted that there are two kinds of modes. Remember that Erich Fromm got this from the Stoics. There is the having mode and the being mode. They are both adaptive. Do you remember? So this is about needs that are met by having, consuming, and controlling. And I treat things categorically so that I can efficiently and effectively consume them and control them. And right? So this marker is like the previous marker, and so I can exchange that marker that's running out of ink with this one, and I can, because it's a marker, I can quickly control it and use it for what I need to do. That's great. So this is, primarily about control. But there are needs that are met not by controlling or consuming. There are needs that are met by transformation and development. So these are developmental needs. These are needs like becoming honest, being an honest person, being an honest person. And these don't sort of, they're not self-terminating the way like when I drink enough water, I drink enough water. But I never get to the place where I say, I'm honest enough. I don't need to be, I don't need to work on being honest, right? That's a very dangerous place to get to when you start to talk that way. All right, so what the Stoics did is this is what Fromm got at, and we talked about this, of how, meta contemplation is about learning to discern and distinguish between these two, and remember the being mode. And remember, Stephen Batchelor argued that Buddhism is all about remembering the being mode. Sati is that deep remembering of the being mode. All right, so the Stoics take it deeper than I presented it, because I was just presenting how it would help understanding meta and Buddhism at the time. But the Stoics really go in here and they say, no, we're going to deepen this ability to discern and distinguish between these. We're going to really help you get better at dealing with modal confusion. All right, so what do they do? Well, here's the Enchiridion, the Manual for Living by Epictetus, one of the great Stoic philosophers. And this is how it begins. This is his manual for how to live well. And this is its very beginning. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the very first page. Happiness and freedom. Notice those two together, by the way. We always think of Stoicism as sort of this dour. No. Happiness and freedom begin with a clear understanding of one principle. Some things are within our control, and some things are not. It is only after you have faced up to this fundamental rule and learned to distinguish between what you can and can't control that inner tranquility and outer effectiveness. Inner tranquility, ataraxia, the Epicureans, outer effectiveness. Outer effectiveness is also important. Remember that, please. Become possible. So, what the Stoics say is, one way in which we get into deep modal confusion is we are deeply deluded about what's in our control and how much control we have. So the Stoics would point out to two really important facts, which one is the proliferation of consequences, and the other is the fatality of all things. Okay, so here is a fact we all know to be true, and yet we ignore it almost moment by moment. Most of our plans fail, and most of the time we are disappointed with the results of things. Not always, but most of the time. We are disappointed, frustrated, and we fail in the sense that things don't go as planned. Why? Well, this has to do with the fact that we're going to do action A, and we intend for it to have consequence B. Great. The problem is, and think about this when you take medication, there are always side effects. There are always side effects. And in fact, the side effects outnumber the intended effects. This is one of the problems we're facing when we're trying to make artificial intelligence. We just do an action and we know what the intended effect is. But right, there's all these side effects, and we pay attention to some of them and ignore most of them, and that's key to our intelligence. And then here's the problem: when B occurs, B not only produces what we might foresee C, it produces this. And each one of these is, right, and you see what's happening? You get the proliferation of side effects. And so for the Stoics, trying to control, it doesn't mean you don't act, but thinking that you can move the world, that's how they often put it, is mostly delusional. Again, they're not quietists. Remember, outer effectiveness. You're trying, so what you need to do is you need to enhance your ability to zero in on the relevant side effects, not just the narrative intention, not just where the story's, not where you're in, you've got this story, this is how it's going to go. That's okay, that's this. But you need to open up your ability to zero in on much more of the world and acknowledge how much of this you do not have control over. So let's take something that I work with daily. Oh, surely I have control over my own body. And the Stoics will say, well, no, you don't. And I have Meniere's disease. Right now, it's challenging me. Right now, I'm feeling a little bit of vertigo. Right, and I can do things. I can do things that make a difference, effective, but I can't control all of it. It's beyond me. Even aspects of my body. Now, this is not to put you into despair. Okay, so hang on to this. What's the fatality of all things? The fatality of all things is the universe is so complex. Remember what I talked about narrative bias. The universe is way beyond our narrative bias. So we have our stories, and we think this is the way things are running, and romantic comedies really seduce us into this. And somehow the universe and our stories, the fact is, the fatality of death is fatal. It is fate. It is an aspect of fate. Remember we talked about this? Meaning that death comes independent of how great your narrative is. You can have met this wonderful woman who you adore and is amazing and is lifting your heart as no other person has, and you step into traffic and you're hit by a truck. The truck doesn't go, oh, well, John has finally found the love of his life. Truck hits you, you die. It's fatal. It's absurd. When Camus made a big deal of this, right? So when the Stoics, and this is kind of harsh, this is where you get the idea of the stiff upper lip of Stoicism. The Stoics want to hold up in our face. This is Diogenes holding up the lamp. Pay attention to the way things really are. Pay attention to the way things really are. So, what is in our control? Our judgment. So the thing when we focus on the object, and we're going to try and control the object, we're actually probably going to lose to a large degree for all the reasons I've just said. And what we don't pay attention to, what we're transparent, what we're looking through, is our judgment. But we can exercise tremendous control over a judgment if we properly train it. So again, what's our judgment mean? Setting our heart on something, what we find relevant, what we find salient, how we identify, how we create identities, agent-arena relationships, existential modes. And the Stoics have this term, prosos, which means paying attention to how you pay attention. It's one of their fundamental principles, paying attention to how you pay attention, which is why a lot of people compare Stoicism to mindfulness and Buddhism. Okay, so what you want to do is get to a place where you are realizing that meaning making, in the sense of what you find relevant and salient and identify with, is much more in your control. And what that means is also meaning making is proper to the being mode. That's what the being mode is all about. It's a way of getting you to shift into the being mode. And the idea here is we can do this better. Remember we talked about this, reciprocal opening. The Stoics have a very similar thing. They talk about joy, which is learning to flow with nature. I bet you didn't think about that in connection with Stoicism. Joy and learning to flow with nature. So, what we have to do in order to properly tutor what follows from this, and what we have to do to properly tutor our judgment, is we have to learn in our attention to make a distinction between events and our judgments about the events. Because they are almost always, and this is what narrative does, they're almost always confused together. They're confused together. So we have to get better at tracking how things are actually unfolding. We have to get better at tracking reality as much as possible. We want what we find relevant to, as much as possible, track what is real. And remember, that doesn't necessarily mean what comes most readily or easily to us. So this is the Stoic practice of rationality. Rationality here doesn't mean inference control primarily, or just being logical. The Stoics actually put three things together: logic, ethics, and physics. And logic is much more like psychologic. It's much more learning an ecology of practices for enhancing and improving your capacity for judgment, your ability to make relevance track what is most real. And that's a very hard thing to do. Okay, so a better way to think about this is more like the logos. Make those patterns of intelligibility that are relevant to us, but also track the real patterns in the world. And here's the thing. Logos, your ability to discern and be aware of the logos, is ultimately dependent on your inner dialogos, your inner dialogue, So, how do we transform our inner dialogue? I'll just briefly indicate what we're going to talk about next time, and then give you some ideas about some practices we're going to engage in. So the basic idea, and one way you can understand all of Stoicism is the practice of internalizing Socrates. This goes right back to Antisthenes. We talked about internalizing the sage. How do we internalize Socrates so that we can transform our inner dialogos, so that we can become more rational, so that our ability to set our hearts more reliably tracks the real patterns, and so that we are more reliably within the being mode, and that we are more reliably free from frustration, despair, and disappointment, and free to experience and drink from the depths of the being mode itself. That's what we're going to talk about next time. We're going to talk about what Socratic self-knowledge looks like, and we're going to notice the connections. We can reach back to philosophical contemplative companionships and reach forward. We'll look forward, foreshadowing Platonic dialectic. And we're going to start talking about practices for how we do this. How do we cultivate rationality? Well, active open-mindedness. But we're also going to teach you how to do that. And this internalization, it's going to involve perspectival transformation. I'm going to teach you about the view from above, objective seeing, the premeditatio. We're going to take a look at some of the Stoic spiritual exercises from Buzare. So that's what's coming. It's so exciting and it's so enriching. I think I trespassed a little bit on our time for questions today. I'll make sure next time to end a little bit earlier. But I wanted to get to at least this point, so I hope you forgive me for trespassing a little bit into the question time. We'll make sure that I set aside 15 minutes next Saturday to address the questions that are probably mounting. So we're just going to end it here for today. And I hope you can see I'm very excited about this. Stoicism has a lot to offer us. I have a lot of books. I would recommend getting The Enchiridion by Epictetus. Get the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. This is a particularly good translation by Mark Forstater. The Spiritual Teachings of Marcus Aurelius. And then I'll recommend a whole bunch of books to you also next time. It's so great to be doing this with you all, and I love being in the Saturday Sangha. And so keep reading the McLennan. I know I haven't given you anything to practice yet. We need to get the background. Next time, we'll finish off the background and we'll start right into the exercises and the spiritual exercises. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Take good care, everybody. Okay.